The image is simple and cruel, an applause that never ends, a cape folding into shadow, a face that the cameras loved until the lights stopped loving it back. George Reeves, 1914 to 1959, became, for a moment, the very idea of a savior. He stood beneath the lamps, chest forward, smile calibrated for millions. The world learned to believe that a man in blue could make wrongs right. The world learned to cheer. But symbols are porous. They take more than they give. What the public called comfort, the private called a cost. The cape collected attention like dust. The accolade left a hollow where a life should be. Reeves's name sits at the beginning of a strange ledger of misfortune, a ledger that seems to add up across decades and actors, across triumphs and quiet endings. The pattern is not tidy. It is a shadow edged in coincidence, an echo that will not stop.
This is not a plea for ghosts. This is not an accusation. It is an observation of repetition. Creators who died with claims undone, actors bound to an impossible integrity, careers that rose fast and flamed out. From the comic pages crafted in scarcity to men and women who put on a cape and were asked to be more than human, a question forms at the edges of every headline. What does a symbol extract from the person beneath it? The story to come will not invent scandal where there is none. It will place facts side by side as if the lights themselves might reveal a seam. It will trace the lives that wore the S and the small ruptures that followed. For some, the cape was costume. For others, it became a language of sacrifice. And somewhere between celluloid and silence, the idea of Superman began to carry a quieter cost.
It began not with a man who could fly, but with two boys who could not escape. Cleveland, 1933. Jerry Siegel, a shy, restless dreamer, lost his father to violence in the middle of the night. Joe Shuster, a poor artist with broken glasses, drew on scraps of paper under the dim light of his parents' apartment. Out of grief and hunger, they created a savior, Superman, a being untouched by bullets, by death, by the cruelty of men. But the world they gave him to was not kind. When Action Comics #1 hit the stands in 1938, Superman became an instant phenomenon. Warner Brothers saw gold. The boys saw a contract. For $130, Siegel and Shuster sold the rights to their creation forever. By the time they realized what they'd done, Superman had already left them behind.
They built a god and were paid like beggars. It was the first fracture in the myth. The savior was born of loss, and his creators would die forgotten. The curse didn't begin with death. It began with the idea that to create a symbol, someone must first be broken by it. And as Superman soared across screens and hearts, those who carried his image on page, on screen, in body, and in voice began to feel the same silent pull that had once taken his makers. The cape had chosen its first believers, and soon it would start collecting them one by one.
The camera loved them all at first. Every man who wore the cape began the same way, with light in his eyes and the echo of destiny behind him. But Hollywood's spotlight burns. It doesn't illuminate, it consumes. The first Superman to truly live on screen. In the early 1950s, he became a symbol of decency, hope, and strength. A man children believed could never die. But fame trapped him inside that image. Producers refused to cast him in anything else. He wasn't George anymore. He was Superman. And Superman doesn't age, doesn't falter, doesn't bleed. On June 16, 1959, he was found dead in his bedroom, a single gunshot to the head. The official story said suicide. The neighbors heard arguing, the gunpowder burns didn't match, and Hollywood whispered of jealous lovers and powerful studios that needed silence. The first Superman had fallen. The symbol had taken its first breath of life.
Christopher Reeve, 1952 to 2004. 2 decades later, another man put on the cape. Handsome, gentle, articulate, Christopher Reeve became the face of purity itself. He was Superman in every sense. But the curse doesn't always kill. Sometimes it cripples. In 1995, his horse stumbled during a competition, a random, meaningless accident, and Reeve was left paralyzed from the neck down. Yet he refused pity. He spoke of hope, of flight, of believing in miracles. But hope, too, has a cost. His body withered while his myth grew. And when he died in 2004, the world mourned the loss of a hero who had tried too hard to remain superhuman.
Margot Kidder, Lois Lane, the woman who loved Superman. She too became trapped between fiction and the fragile bones of real life. Fame faded, the roles disappeared, and her mind began to fracture. In 1996, she vanished for days, found wandering the streets, frightened, unrecognizable. Hollywood called it mental illness, but to those who knew the stories, it was another echo in the curse, the shadow of the Savior falling on those who stood too close. Others who wore the cape, Dean Cain, Brandon Routh, Henry Cavill, each touched glory and each watched it crumble. Their careers faltered, their names faded, or their roles were taken from them without warning. Every generation of Superman ended the same way, lost, silenced, or forgotten. It was as though the character absorbed all their strength, leaving the men beneath hollow, an empty shell shaped like hope. They became symbols, and symbols don't live, they linger. The cape didn't just crown them, it fed on them, and by the time the audience applauded their flight, the fall had already begun. Every legend bleeds somewhere. Superman was meant to be invincible, a beacon untouched by the pain of ordinary men. But behind that indestructible symbol, the lives it touched began to fracture in eerily familiar ways. It was as if the cape itself had memory, and mercy was not among the things it remembered. George Reeves died with a bullet in his head, and questions no one dared to answer. Christopher Reeve lived, but could no longer move, the very image of strength trapped inside a body of silence. Margot Kidder fought the ghosts of her own mind until they took her entirely. Different decades, different faces, same ending, isolation, despair, a quiet fall from the sky. And it didn't stop. Writers, directors, stuntmen, those who brushed too close to the S carried a strange gravity afterward. Failed marriages, bankruptcies, depressions that came without reason. A journalist once called it Hollywood's kryptonite. Maybe it wasn't death that haunted them. Maybe it was expectation, the impossible demand to live up to something larger than life, while their own lives fell apart in secret.
To play a god is to invite the loneliness of one. Superman wasn't just a role. It was a cage lined with applause. Every actor who wore that cape carried the burden of perfection, and perfection kills slowly. It doesn't strike like lightning, it drains one heartbeat at a time. Hollywood kept the myth alive because the world needed to believe in heroes. But each new Superman came with a quieter promise that he too would eventually pay the same price. In the reflection of that red and blue suit, hope and horror blurred until no one could tell them apart. The bloodline of the cape had been written, and those who followed were only reciting it again. They called it a curse because humans have always needed a name for the things they cannot explain. But what if it wasn't supernatural? What if it was something worse, something human? The so-called curse of Superman can be traced not to magic, but to the machinery of myth. Hollywood built a god, then demanded that its chosen vessels remain divine. Every man who played Superman was told the same unspoken rule: be perfect or be forgotten. George Reeves couldn't escape that demand. Christopher Reeve tried to embody it until his body gave way. Even Henry Cavill, the modern savior with steel eyes, was replaced, recast, erased from the role without ceremony. No curse, no ghost, just a system that devours its icons and calls the remains timeless. But the pattern is too precise to dismiss. Each Superman suffers not from bad luck, but from the unbearable pressure of carrying the world's need for salvation.
The cape becomes a mirror, and in it they see not themselves, but the version the world wants them to be. And once you stop being that version, Hollywood stops seeing you at all. Maybe the curse isn't the deaths. Maybe the curse is the silence that follows when the world moves on. Psychologists call it the Superman complex, the delusion of omnipotence, the slow erosion of identity beneath responsibility. But in Hollywood, that complex isn't a diagnosis. It's a job description. The actors become the myth until the myth consumes the man. And by the time they realize it, the cape has already chosen another. So maybe the curse is real. Not because it's mystical, but because belief itself can be lethal. A curse made of cameras, contracts, and the human hunger for heroes.
In the end, the cape always finds its way back to the rack. The studio lights dim, the applause fades into memory, and the man who once defied gravity stands face to face with something heavier than flight: silence. George Reeves is long gone, his death still echoing between reels of old film. Christopher Reeve's name is now engraved not just on a headstone, but in the fragile hope of everyone who ever wanted to rise again. Margot Kidder's laughter survives only in flickering clips, and the rest, the ones who came later, live carefully, as if aware that the costume carries something invisible. Hollywood will tell you it's coincidence. Historians will call it pressure. Fans will whisper, it's fate.
But between the sound of clapping hands and the hiss of a camera shutting down, there's a pause. And in that pause lives something cold, something watching, something that remembers. The S was meant to stand for Superman, but maybe it always meant sacrifice. Because every symbol demands an offering, and the brighter the light, the darker the shadow it casts. Maybe that's the real curse. Not death, not tragedy, but the quiet truth that even heroes are human, and that humanity is what the cape takes first. The reel ends, the screen fades to black, and somewhere in a locked vault in Burbank, an old costume sleeps beneath a layer of dust, waiting.